Welcome back to part two of Don't Worry About the Government. Chris Novembrino still here. Doug still here. William still here. We don't vote people off the island between part one and part two. That's a different show. So getting back into the coronavirus stuff, we talked in the first part of about what this looks like practically for both Doug and William. So go back and watch part one if you're interested in that, or listen to part one if you're someone who's listening on a podcast and likes to start in the middle. And I don't really know how that works mechanically speaking, but let's get back into it. Guys, on a practical level, do you think that this was too soon? Do you think that they should have waited until fall? Or do you think it's good to get back in the schools like during the middle of this second semester for what would be fourth quarter for many students?
Well, I'll say this. First of all, if you talked about the New York Times published that the CDC thresholds where they talked about for high school and middle school, if you know they basically looked at counties and they colored them, green if they are good for full in-person learning, yellow if they're good for hybrid, and then red if they should stick with full-time remote learning. Uh, my county is red, but we're going to full remote. However, that things could change. It also we have to factor in the fact that we all, the entire staff is now had the opportunity to be vaccinated. So I think the vaccine really did kind of change a lot of things for a lot of people. Um, but as far as is this too soon? I just from a practical standpoint, it is now March 4th as we're recording this. Uh, the school year is going to be done in less than 3 months at this point.
Yeah.
Um, I do I do question uh, how. I mean, I understand why a lot of people in the community, a lot of people want to go back, and I'll even say this as a parent myself with an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old, going to be 8. Um, she's in second grade, and as just being home when she's been doing remote learning has been pretty fine. But I understand that not everyone has the luxury and is as privileged as I am to be able to teach remotely. And you know, I understand that just daycare in general is a very difficult thing. And I think that obviously the response and the relief and support that the federal government has been providing throughout this entire coronavirus has not been adequate enough to uh, assist with that financially, because that is a horrible financial burden. I mean, I'm going back once I go back next week. I'm going to be paying upwards of about $600 a month just in like childcare on the days that my daughter is not going to be in the building because she's going to be remote.
Yeah.
So she's going to have to go to like the YMCA where I'm and just working there remotely. And uh, I understand why a lot of people want that relief. But practically, from just like an educational standpoint, I don't know how much extra they're going to get out of it from just this little bit of time, as opposed to waiting uh, throughout the summer and just coming back and hopefully coming back fresh, especially given the fact that there's still going to be a bit of a learning curve, an adjustment curve of just getting back and into the swing of things as they kind of figure out how to do this hybrid model that they've never done before. And by then, my hunch is they're finally going to figure it out just as we're about to go on summer break.
Yep.
Yeah, my hunch is they will figure it out right kind of close to where we're at the end of this pandemic. But I think you're sort of speaking to one of the bigger problems that has been going throughout this, which is like changing what the educational model is without necessarily fully retraining the teachers on that. So like when you guys got transitioned into doing remote learning, like what was the retraining like for y'all?
So for me, it wasn't terrible for a couple of unique reasons, I think. So I had actually, like, our school adopted, I have no idea if this is the same program you guys would use, but we use something called Schoology. It's just like, it literally looks like Facebook, but it's for like teaching. It's pretty straight. I find it to be pretty straightforward. Now, I am also pretty tech savvy. Like I used to sell computers and things like that. Like so I pretty like I understand like how to deal with technology and stuff. But I had taken a PD, a professional development day, on using Schoology like 2 weeks before we went virtual.
Oh, nice.
So it was like just random that I just took it as like my 5th PD day. And then I was like, oh, I'll start using this. It'll reduce the amount of paper I have to collect. You know, I'll have the kids use the computers a little bit, help them with their typing skills and things like that. And then lo and behold, 2 weeks later, we went virtual early compared to the rest of the world because we had a tornado through Nashville
Oh, sure.
that tore up like a huge part of Nashville last March, like this week, last March. And so we were like out for a few days of basically snow days essentially, but really because of electricity and things like that. And then that rolled into COVID days. So for me, it hasn't been terrible. Two things: our school provided a online learning platform on Schoology. Like they had our district has a virtual school that they've had for years for kids with special needs that maybe just really don't function well in the regular school building, you know, or
Sure.
they opt in for a variety of reasons. And so they just expanded that to everybody, said everybody has access to that. It's not great. I don't want to be like overly critical, but I find some pretty serious grammatical and factual errors as I read through it, in stuff that I'm supposed to present to children as sort of best writing, right? As like,
Right.
you know, a
Sure.
good
Sure.
example. So that's pretty frustrating. And I've heard them that other subjects, some teachers just don't use it because they're like, this is just unusable. But it's still there. Like it's still something, right? We can't say they didn't provide anything for us. And you know, so it's gone okay for me, but I imagine there's a number of teachers in the district that it hasn't. And I appreciate Doug's perspective here because like I don't have kids. So I work with a number of teachers that are trying to teach virtually and have children at home virtually, right? Or maybe they're now back in person, but their kids are remaining virtual, you know, and that makes another thing.
Yeah, for me it was my daughter just went back last month. Like she was full virtual, and then which is just like a second grader on Zoom in the other room while I'm trying to teach in the other room. It's very very weird. But it's in terms of the preparation that before I go into the preparation my district went into, I should just kind of mention that shortly before COVID happened, I was wrapping up my PhD and I actually finished it in COVID. And my dissertation was on, blended online and in-person environments for students with disabilities. And just basically looking at what teachers are doing in the online environment pre-COVID. So it was extremely topical, but at the same time, it's extremely outdated now. And
right. Yeah.
So, but I do,
but also in the past.
Yes. So it's just like in the before times. But it's interesting looking at that and just what I found was that a lot of teachers in their online teaching was almost entirely asynchronous, not in real time teaching, where it was usually like they had a Google Classroom page or Schoology. I was one of the people I in my study use Schoology, or they'll use some other program like that where it's like they'll throw assignments online, and then if it's an online day where they're not seeing the kids, it's like, hey, you get it done, you can submit it, but there's no real interaction. There's no real-time interaction. Right. There's no Zoom video. The closest thing to maybe a real type interaction to maybe be sharing comments on a Google Doc.
Yeah,
that's the extent of it. So I think that I know for a fact that when we went in back in March of 2020, when we all went virtual at first, the synchronous was not nearly what it is now. Like you're not seeing a lot of Zoom taking place. You're not seeing a lot of real-time interactions taking place. But I mean, in my district, I think a lot of schools already had some type of program that they were using to kind of keep track of the class that somewhat transferred over. Like I use Google Classroom for my class to just kind of organize the class. And then right now for my classes, I use Google Meets to do my my class virtual meetings. But I also have the ability to use Zoom. My district provides Zoom. My district also provides Microsoft Teams. So we have options that we could go ahead and use, and different teachers use different things. But I think a lot of it was just kind of figuring out on the job, but it was definitely, some rushed PDs that they were throwing together that to just get everyone on board. And especially during, school institute days at the start of the school year, making sure everyone's on the same page and knows what they need to do and what's expected of them.
Yeah. No, I figured like it seems hard to me that to make kind of the conceptual changes. Either you know how to use the technology, either you know how to use Zoom and Skype, or you don't.
Like I love some of the older teachers I've worked with over the years, and I don't blame them for but
it would have been really fun to have on this show. It occurs to me
yes.
now, as I'm talking to you two, I was like, the big oversight here that I made was I got young people. No knock on y'all, but like we're young, so like we make these adaptations. We get it, we swim, and we learn the new software relatively quickly and relatively painlessly. And we also think about how to present on these sorts of things relatively quickly and relatively painlessly because we just think about the different mediums. But if you're older and you have taught for 25 years in a classroom and you've been doing your you've been teaching this class the same way for a decade now. You've been doing it 25 years, but like shit hasn't changed since 2010. And I think those people are really hit hard by this.
Yeah, it's a lot of trial and error. I mean, and I haven't been teaching for 25 years, but I've been teaching. I've been teaching a while. I'm older than probably both of you, I would imagine.
How old are you?
I'm 35.
I'm 34. You're not that much older than me.
Yeah, a little bit. You're 5 years older than me.
Okay. Well, Chris, I thought you were a lot younger. Good.
Well, so, I get that one a lot. I think it's just because I'm immature.
Well, either way, I have been teaching for about 12 years. So even 12 years, that being thrown into this is still really difficult. And it definitely took a lot of trial and error, to say the least. And because there's definitely just playing a video or playing, some other type of game with the students to kind of keep them engaged. It's like a lot of times it's just, a PD is great, but sometimes you just got to do it and try to figure out what works best in your particular situation.
Well, like we had an email go out at the beginning of the year from admin that was like, you have to turn your cameras on as teachers. I'm like, there's teachers that aren't turning their cameras on? Like what? Like what? Like, is that what we're doing? And I have no idea who they were talking about. It's not all, whatever.
No, I get it. I remember, I don't know what college was like for y'all, but I remember I had some teachers who got into the online thing. I used to hate it back in college because it was what Doug was describing, asynchronous learning. You go on, or they would ask you to participate in some sort of message board thing. And that sucked because like message boards sucked anyways back in the day.
I have been using discussion boards a lot. I'll be honest. I've been
but like nothing sucks more than the mandatory discussion board, William.
I agree. I agree.
Make sure you reply to 2 other posts.
Oh my
God.
Yep. That was hell. I hated that shit. No, I think the visual component's super important, and like. Look, even in terms of children's attention spans or whatever, from my own experience teaching Zoom, and granted, mine's one-on-one because I'm doing music proctoring. Look, if you are an engaging and entertaining presenter, you can keep a child's attention for 60 minutes. Yeah, I don't have a problem where I'm like, will you stop looking at your feet? Like, could you please stop touching that?
Well, I will say this, though. I do think that that's a problem. The engagement is difficult because you are limited a lot. I mean, I had one of the teachers in my district actually, like, he tweeted out a funny thing where like people were like asking, what do you explain what you do for a living in like the worst way or something like that, and he basically said, I talk about U.S. history to a bunch of black boxes all day, just because
I think I told Chris, like, it's like being an AM radio DJ. Like,
it's like
talking to the void.
Yeah, because and that's the other thing. It's like you have a lot of your students won't put their cameras on, and my district and my school, hopefully they're not listening right now, but they tell us to make sure that we have the kids put the cameras on, and that's not something that I always do.
Yeah.
And I struggle with that in the sense that I understand like a lot of times the kids don't feel, comfortable, or, they're maybe self-conscious about their house and what's behind them and situations like that.
Yep.
It's invading their space. So it's not something I generally will do. Like at the beginning of the school year, I might have said, hey, just so you know, the school wants us to turn cameras on, so
Yep.
appreciate if you can. But I tell it once and that's it. I just don't. I have a hard time doing that. But the flip side of that though is I have a lot of students who, you know, aren't super engaged in class, and they'll get the work done and they'll finish everything and they'll do it on their own. But I'm not having any engaging classroom discussions about
Yeah.
the merits of FDR's New Deal, or whether or not uh, you know whether or not the 1920s was a prosperous time for Americans or not. And it's just these are things that I would normally do in a normal classroom environment and really find a way to engage. But it's very difficult when, as I said, you're speaking into the void, as William said.
Well, it's like on Wednesday, I guess yesterday, I did a lesson that I gave my other social studies teacher that I love doing on Plato's allegory of the cave, and just going through some philosophical concepts. But it's a lesson that you really need engagement with, because you're asking questions, you're trying to have the students, probe into different concepts, like how do we know what is reality, like matrix style sort of things. And it was awesome. But my virtual class did all right, because I sort of prompted them like, hey, I really need some participation here. But it was the same sort of 5-6 students that I was expecting to participate out of like 25. Um, and it made a huge difference being in person and doing that, because I can just look at someone and also know, oh yeah, I'll raise my hand and share what I have to say, and that sort of thing. So that was like, it just felt great being back in person, doing a lesson like that and having that engagement. Because I'm sort of the same way as Doug. Like, technically, I think we were supposed to have our cameras on, but I can only just say that so many times.
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
it's not
You can't stop the whole class for it, but I do.
right.
I gotta say, I do really worry, I guess, broadly speaking, that like without the camera on, that like that really does actually reduce the child's ability to learn.
I think it does.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's something to
Yeah.
even just the act of knowing that this sounds weird. I think the act of knowing that you're on camera and having to at least look alert is actually probably a healthy exercise, especially at that age.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a skill building thing. And look, I'm like Mr. Fourth Amendment, right to privacy, dude. I'm not like learn to love being on camera all the time, young man. But like, I think there's actually something healthy about having to practice the act of being attentive. And I worry that having your camera off plays into an ability to like, kind of mindfully like noodle around with your cat or like dibble around with the guitar or something, or just not be there. And the camera makes you respect someone else.
Yeah, you don't have that lack of engagement, and just a lot of times you have that. If you have an out, you're gonna take it. And it's like, oh, I could just kind of like throw my camera on mute and just do something else.
Yep.
And
Yeah. I mean, Lord knows, with one of these contracting jobs I've had, where I had to do curation or had to do huddles, right? And we would do huddles. I would try to find ways to go on camera off so I could start making coffee and stuff during the meeting, especially if they were like talking, or like start making food or something, because I can just, and for my part too, I'm like, I'm listening. I just want to do anything else. And I actually think like that's fine for a work meeting, but I actually think that it's a bad exercise to get into as a student.
I agree with that. I mean, like, I think I've had some very, like, I don't know all the kids I've had virtually, because like Doug, we've been virtual since March until last week. So
they're gonna
like
come
March
to the
of
classroom.
2020.
I'm not gonna know. I'm not gonna know.
Oh, you won't, especially with a mask on, dude. You won't recognize any of them. I couldn't recognize a single kid, even the ones I had seen in person, or like not seen in person, but seen on camera.
Yeah, sure.
And I think I have some very, very highly capable kids, students, like who could be very high achievers in academics, who, because it's virtual, are really underachieving from their own capability, because they are, like you're saying, turn the camera off, walk away, not paying attention. Maybe they are listening, but they're not really engaged.
Right,
They're
right, right,
not
right, right.
really like, they're not thinking critically about the information, because both of us teach social studies, and thinking critically is kind of like the main thing. Um, and I think that, I hope that when they go to seventh grade, they aren't behind in that regard. Not necessarily behind in terms of content, but behind in terms of having to use that active portion of their brain more for the last year. I don't know if there's any science behind that or not, but that's just sort of my thoughts about it.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really fair concern. And yeah, I mean, even from music proctoring, it's not so much about, especially when I'm doing like theory and stuff. It's not so much about the surface level concept. Like, someone can nod along with me and be like, modulation. Yes, I
Yeah.
get that. Yeah, key of C. Yes, I get that. The more important part is connecting those deeper fundamental concepts. And like, I think you're right. It's critical thinking, and that requires active listening, and
Yeah.
active thinking about the subject, so that the stuff that's going on beneath surface level is actually happening. And that can't happen. You can passively listen to something if you're noodling, around with the cat. Like, I can pet the cat and, play with the cat or whatever. But I can't. I'm not really going to think about the 1920s on any real deep level if, part of what I'm trying to do right now is like, play with a little bird toy or something with my cat. I'll be like, yes, 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 the 1920s, yes, 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 stock market, yes, yes, crashing. But I won't actually be able to give you any sort of like real thought on it.
Yeah, and I think the bigger, and this is going to come more so when we come back full time and when this pandemic finally ends, is I think what the lessons that we've learned from this remote learning, and I'm not saying like the lessons of, oh, this is not as good, oh, this is uh kind of this is not as good as being in person, this kind of, they're not as engaged, not necessarily those lessons, but, and I think it's the lessons that people aren't really talking about yet but are going to come up, which is, oh, this is a perhaps a cheaper way to teach. Oh, this is perhaps a good way to deal with students who are troublemakers in class, and but or you're even worse, the students or the parents who kind of like the idea that they don't have to deal with going to school, and they could just kind of hop on Zoom and they make the argument saying that, hey, I've been doing really well, or I've been passing my classes. I don't understand why I have to go to school anymore. Why can't we just do this from now on? And
And the
and I and
homeschooling movement. I'll tell you, you brought up those. I was thinking, like, what will this do for the homeschooling movement, where it will energize them to go, like, we could set up a whole series of Zoom homeschooling, and basically just pass these kids through and get them to what is the equivalent of a GED. Maybe they won't be fit for society, but it will go a long way to really advance the homeschooling movement.
and not only that, the schools that do start thinking that way, uh, I question the marginalized groups that are likely going to be the ones that are disproportionately going to be told that, you know what, you're pretty good on the remote learning on the Zoom call, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a situation where they start making arguments that say students with emotional disabilities or other behavioral disabilities suddenly should be taught outside of the general
Yes.
education environment and put in more of these more restrictive placements, being the home,
Yep.
under the guise that, well, it's all one big educational environment because this is now uh, part of school, this remote learning, we've adopted it, and that is a concern that I have going forward, that this is what we're going to see a movement or a push towards this.
Oh, I think you're spot on, dude. I mean, what's the easiest way if you're someone running a district? Our district has 86,000 students. If you're someone running a district, what's the easiest way to reduce expulsions and alternative school placements? Just put them in virtual.
Put them in virtual.
They're still enrolled in the same school. They're still enrolled in the normal school. They didn't get
Yeah,
expelled.
you're still getting the attendance money and
Yep.
all the weird stuff that links
Yep.
back to funding, which is I hate to say it, but like from my conversations with both of you all now, I keep thinking the biggest thing underpinning this push is the weird perverse way that we fund districts.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Like Brian, I think when you mentioned Austin, Brian's out in Austin, so he's kind of familiar with this stuff too, in the Austin school district, and it's the same thing down there in Austin. I think they only count as half days when you're not in school, in terms of funding, and it will now count as a full day again. So yeah, no,
Well, I don't know about Doug, but like one of the reasons we got we're back into person, and I think our district would say this isn't the actual reason, and that they have a metric they're using to monitor COVID numbers and things.
oh sure,
But the governor of Tennessee, whose sister was actually one of my middle school teachers, um, he withdrew funding only for Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville, and Chattanooga. It's weird. He only chose the 4 districts that are a little more diverse than the rest
yeah, I
of
was
the
just saying,
state.
what
But
do all those districts have in
yeah,
common that the other parts of Tennessee don't?
right. So he withdrew funding from those if you don't, and it was a state. I think there's actually a bill in the legislature as well. But if you don't have 70 days of in-person schooling, so then all of a sudden it was like, oh well, now we got to go back to school, right? Because yeah.
I'm grateful in Illinois. I don't necessarily have that problem. All our days are considered full, even though we're teaching
Yeah.
remotely. They're considered full days. That's never been an issue. But like I said, there's still going to be that general push to get it back because, I'm telling, like, a lot of people. The reality is, a lot of parents, they got to work.
Yeah, and school provides
Yes.
essentially a form of
Yes.
daycare for those parents.
Yes.
Yep.
And it,
Yep.
it is very expensive for them. And you brought up earlier, and I think this is right. Part of these problems are because government on a federal and state level for the last 15 months now has really not been stepping in and picking up the slack. You've had a $2,000 check passed by the Republican Congress, another $600 check passed, and then there should be this additional $1,400 bringing people up to a grand total of $4,000 for the duration of this pandemic thus far, which, as Doug was sort of illustrating earlier, if you've been paying daycare costs all along, barely covers you. Now, granted, in a lot of cases, the coronavirus relief payments have been giving more for people with children. However, as Doug has pointed out, that's all getting eaten up by additional childcare costs. So, like, money in, money out, while you are sitting at home dealing with this problem.
Yep. I think that's the big issue. And then tying in with that, especially me being in a high school district with a lot of students that have younger siblings who are in elementary school and things like that with parents working. I am going to see a large number of students and high school students who are electing to stay remote because they got to watch their brothers and sisters.
Yep.
And that's just the unfortunate reality of the fact that we have, the government has not had a solution to this in a way to avoid that from happening.
Well,
And I'm not saying I have the solution, but
I don't have the solution on that. I mean, the other big problem here too, as we now get into like our little counterpoint section here, I found an article that kind of gave us a bit of a counterpoint because I was worried that there might be a little bit of myopia. So we should finish off with a little bit of counterpoint here. I feel as though when I'm reading some of these quotes from pediatricians and doctors, people who actually have DR in front of their name and don't call themselves Dr. Nove, for a radio gimmick, like actual doctors. I think the thing that they keep missing is this whole component of asymptomatic transmission. We know the coronavirus is an aerosolic virus. We know that people can carry the coronavirus asymptomatically, and they can shed asymptomatically for upwards of a week or more. I think, they say 10 to 14 days, generally speaking, at least last I heard. Maybe it's only 7 now, but still, that's a long time. And most people, most children, because we do not live in a Lord of the Flies situation, most children go home to households with adults in them. And so the real concern to me is like so much of the argument that these pediatricians make about why we should reopen elementary schools and why it's even okay to open high schools is that kids are less susceptible to coronavirus. Well, most children are going home to households with two adults in them. In some cases, if you got grandma or grandpa living with you, three, four, but usually at minimum, at least one adult in there. And I do worry that the science doesn't seem to really accurately be reflecting the asymptomatic thing. I'll read a quote since we're in here. I completely understand teachers and other school employees' fears about returning to school, but there are now many well-conducted scientific studies showing that it is safe for schools to reopen with the appropriate precautions, even without vaccination, said Dr. Rebecca Same, an assistant professor to pediatric infectious diseases at Washington University in St. Louis. They are much more likely to get infected from the outside community and from family members than the school contacts. Like, I read that quote, in particular the second part of it, where it's they are much more likely to get infected from the outside community and family members than school contacts. And it seems to me to be a really circular logic of aren't your family members going to be going to school? Aren't they going to be in contact with the outside community? Like, does not school then become a new node of the outside community?
Yeah, and I think that that's just unfortunately the reality. I mean, this is the situation. I think when they're trying to be very data driven, but a lot of times data shows what you want it to show, and you see what you want to see.
That's
Yeah, and
that's kind of what I feel like. This is massaging data to see a thing rather than actually kind of thinking your way through the problem, especially building to building.
well, and I think Chris, we talked about this the other day. It was just that, like, and I'm sure Doug probably feels the same way. Like the amount of, if you work in a public school system, the amount of students you have that are raised by their grandparents, and a lot of those grandparents are not necessarily really old. Like my grandmother was like 97 by the time she died, but like they might be younger, but they're still older than normal parents. If that makes sense, like a quote unquote normal parents,
Yeah.
Um, and that's what sort of has been concerning to me from day one of this whole thing, was I have so many students that are being raised by their grandparents, and the student might be completely healthy, and they happen to accidentally take home a virus that can really, really harm the people that are caring for them and providing for them. And that's why, our district, and more power to them, I don't always like the school board, but I do really like the woman who's the head of the district. She's been saying, from just like, she's been serious about this from day one, because I think she feels the same concern of, like, you know, we could be orphaning kids
Right,
in
right,
a
yeah.
way,
Another quote here says this is devastating a generation, and I'm thinking about this, in that one's talking about not having human contact, not being in person or whatever, and the mental health crisis that they kind of keep referring to. But I keep going, man, nothing would devastate me more than losing my parents during the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. I don't know, like, it's kind of a weird thing to end the episode on, but like when my brother's body finally died when I was in college, even though he had been a vegetable for like decades at that point, it still really distressed me. And like I had a really hard time. I was not in the headspace to really be a student that freshman year, and I lost a year of education. Like I was interested in anything other than education at that point. And I feel like that would be the same thing. This coronavirus thing happens. Your dad dies from coronavirus because you went to school and came back. Man, I feel like I'd be checked out for my education for the rest of my education.
Yep, I completely agree.
Doug, what do you think about that?
I mean, that's definitely, and I say this as someone who teaches in a district where, I have, I have students who also are raised by grandparents, and that's Georges have multi-generational homes, and I think that circular argument that you're making, where it's like, hey, the risk is here. It clearly, I think we've kind of just collectively decided that, the risk is worth taking, whether
Yeah,
that's
some people are going to lose
Yeah.
their parents so other people can have an experience that approximates normalcy at 80%.
yeah, we've
Which is a horrible way of putting it, but it's the reality. And I'm
we've
Yeah.
we've done a cost benefit analysis
Yeah.
as a society, and we have we've all, and I think, and I, whether it's right or wrong, I think the fact that this vaccine is finally starting to get out and people are just really gun shy and are really just to just take off and just let's go back to school. The vaccine's here, just because they've been trying for a long time. We're just waiting for a reason, and now they finally have it. And I think that plays a big role into it.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been really concerned, but like these last few days have been really fun in a lot of ways. Like this is why I've been a teacher and I've worked with kids for 10 years, and um because I love it, and I love joking around with kids and seeing them in person and all that kind of stuff. And so like
Oh yeah, dude,
I
I miss
understand the
this
risk is
person.
there, but it's great.
Yeah,
You
no,
know.
look, music's meant to be played in room with people, right?
Right.
I miss being
Right.
able to pull out my bass and actually jam with guitar students and stuff. But yeah, my big concern here is this weird one. A calculus has an impact calculus has been made, and we never had a debate about it. Not a real one, not a formal one where we actually said, do we want to maybe all collectively be a little sadder, but most of us are alive at the end of this? Or do we want to have some people dead as doorknobs and approximate normalcy to try to make us all feel a little bit better? And how many dead people is it worth to us to feel a little bit closer to normal most of the time, even when things aren't normal? And it's sad. So that's gonna do it for this episode of Don't Worry About the Government. Not the happiest note to end it on. Doug, where can people find you on the internet?
You could find me on Twitter at Skeach101. That's SKEACH 101. Just basically tweet about politics and wrestling.
William doesn't want you to find him. You can find this show.
No.
Oh, no. Yeah, I know. At DWATG on Twitter, patreon.com/DWATG to support the show. Buck a show is all we ask if you enjoyed the video. If you've been watching the video, go to Patreon, sub up. You can see them like when they actually come out. Yeah, it's the best way to hear it. Or sub up on iTunes or Stitcher. Until the next one, bye-bye. Cool. All right, so we got out with some room to go. But yeah, no, like that to me is the big thing, is the weird impact calculus where it's like, well, I guess 100,000 people will have to die so I can have some fun at the grocery store.
Yep.
Yeah.
What the fuck?
Like
Yeah,
it's like I don't even know how to. And that's the thing. It's like I don't necessarily